a CPSC warning that came out on motorcycles. And it actually said motorcycle manufacturers have to put in their warning labels that you cannot lick the motor. And we were all just like, yeah, why? Why would you need to tell someone that?
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Folks, we're on for another show of Simply Trade podcast. We've got a special show today with our Simply Trade folks series. And with that, I'm looking forward to today's show. We've got somebody that I have a lot of respect for, that she and I have worked together, I guess, for many years now. And as we get into this, Lalo, I'm going to tell you, this is one of those where we may have some sparks going here, because this guest and I, sometimes it's like oil and water, but we always come out and we always try and strive to come out with at least some kind of compromise or something where we can agree to it, even if it's agree to disagree.
You said that about the episode with Dominic. I mean, but man, that was an amazing episode. I mean, you pretty much said something similar, and that was amazing.
Dominic Veneziano is what he was talking about, folks. Is with formerly with the FDA, and Dominic and I I have a reputation of getting into some intense discussions, and I'll debate them. But on the same token, it was always from staying focused on the issue. And that's paramount, I think.
It's funny because you might be the common denominator of that, Andy, because Brenda said the same thing. Cindy's going to say the same thing. Cynthia Wittenberg said the same thing.
Oh, my gosh, you're right.
Dominic said the same thing. So I don't know, Andy. There's like a trend there.
Yeah, it's like sometimes I'm kind of like that burr under the saddle of folks, I guess. I don't know. But folks, let me tell you, we have somebody that, again, I have a lot of respect for. Her name is Cindy Allen. She's been in the industry for several years.
You can say it. 35 years.
I was like, I don't know how long that was. Anyway, but you still, you're just like, what, 29 and holding? It was like,
Definitely. And at some point after you pass the 50 or 55 mark, it's like, who cares?
Yeah, right.
At that point, it's like, I don't think I'm 25 anymore. So I'm good. I'm proud to be a veteran of my 40s. Let me put it that way.
There you go. Well, Lalo and I both been around since dirt. So it's like, in the industry a while.
Do you know what, Andy? I think it's so funny because we've worked together I was trying to figure out, 20 years, but we've never worked for the same company. We've always worked together to make the industry better, but from different perspectives. So I think that equally passionate from our own perspective, and I think that's where a lot of folks think, oh, I just coming online and arguing with Andy, it's like, okay, after that happens, you need a drink, right? But I think in the end, it's really helped get to the best possible solution in the end. So thank you for your arguing.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. I will say that we really, I guess one thing that I can say for as far as me, I think y'all would consider me somewhat passionate about whatever issue I'm taking on. But on the same token, this is one that, you and I had really hammered through a lot of things when you stepped into the customs role. And talk through some things. And I'll never forget, man, I don't know, it happened several times. We always seem to have some phenomenal one-on-one discussions after we'd been meeting with people, talking with them. And invariably we'd be sitting at some conference in, the bar or whatever. And we reach over and grab a napkin and we start drawing out little flow charts and different things. And folks would come in and sit down and start trying to add to the conversation. We're like, we're already 3 steps past that one.
Yeah. And I think that's because not a lot of trade folks are known for their vision and for understanding where the issues are. And they understand that. They try to use tools that are present today to solve it instead of looking at what's possible and how is the industry going to change in the future. And I think that really, there were a certain group of individuals who would sit down and say, okay, let's hash this out, not just for today, but for the future. We've got to position ourselves for a better future using current technology. So I think a lot of those, perceived arguments were really wholesome discussions on how we could really make a difference and really change things for the future. And everyone would come around eventually, but you need those few key folks like Brenda, like Dominic, like you, like me, to sit down at the table and say, what's the art of the possible? And then what can we do? And that's what a lot of those informal discussions really meant. And I so wish I had kept the napkin from the simplified entry where we
Man, I'll tell you what, that would be gold right now. It was, I will say, and one thing, folks, what Cindy is referencing there, we have both had the honor to, and Cindy and Brenda co-led that, I believe. It was the Entry Simplification Working Group, which was a government private sector initiative. And I had the privilege of working with a lot of other folks that were on that, and Cindy, you and Brenda did a great job with that. And we literally re-engineered the entry process that is adopted today. And you all have taken it even further. I will say, I wished that we had taken a group photo at some point, because we never really did. We were so focused on getting something done. And the other thing is, and again, and I salute, I told Brenda this, I salute you as well. We put that working group together from the very first meeting to we were able to develop a program, get a lot of agencies involved with the government, and launch a pilot program in less than 1 year. And that's moving at lightning speed.
It was actually, we had the first pilot program out in 90 days. and I remember that was because we had done a lot of discussion internally. And I remember meeting with then Commissioner Burson. And we said, okay, we don't think we can do much. Here's what we can do. Here's the outline. And I just remember him kind of flinging the presentation back across the table and saying, this doesn't work for me. You have 90 days. Cindy, go make this happen. Brenda, you're going to support her. Kevin McAleenan was the assistant commissioner at OFO at the time. Kevin, you're going to support her. Go get something done. So that was my mandate. And, you got to listen to the boss. And so I remember it was a sprint, 90 days. And we had the first pilot out, kind of testing it out. And, you and I both worked for FedEx at different times. But I remember calling FedEx saying, I need your help because we need to do this and we need to do it quickly. So are you going to be up and running for 90 days? And I remember talking to you and Fred Klemashevitz, who I have to give the shout out to. Fred was one of my right-hand people when I was at FedEx and couldn't live without him. And he made a lot of those things happen. He really did. He was the brains and the impetus to get a lot of things done at FedEx Trade Networks. And I'll always be a number one fan of his. But he and I, together, and you and a lot of other folks made that happen in 90 days. And there were a lot of different iterations, but that was unheard of, absolutely unheard of. And I know, Commissioner Burson at the time was like, what else can you do? What's
So
next?
I have a question for you. One of the things that, we had gotten to a certain point where we had hammered out. I mean, you got to understand, folks, we had people there that were, big importers, small importers, brokers. I was probably the only carrier related person. We had customs there and different things. And I remember we had the meeting, with the different agencies. We were inviting them in and show them what we had, and it was not going well. And, I was going through and so, we were able to, you, Brenda, a few others said, we need one of your stories or something. And I got up and I said a little story and thing. And apparently you guys relayed that story to Burson. We're talking about licking the calf over again. What's that about? What happened there?
So one of the things that we always used to do when you would come into a meeting, we would start tracking Andy-isms, is what we call them. We started tracking Andy-isms because you would say just like the most off the wall and what we all thought was very Southern oriented, sayings. And, I remember lick the calf, and there were like several of them. I used to have a notebook that had them in there, and Brenda and I and Dan Baldwin was there, and we would like pour over these, and it just provided a sense of levity to the meetings because we would just laugh. And so we were talking about these Andy-isms to Burson, and I think we were talking previous to a meeting, and he came in and he's like, "What are you all talking about?" So we relayed some of the Andy-isms that actually occurred. The licking the calf was the best one because we were all trying to figure out what that really meant. And I remember, I lived in DC. I remember moving to Memphis, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to hear all of these phrases and really understand what they are, only to realize they really are Andy-isms and not really Southern sayings. I've heard some Southern sayings, drunker than Cooter Brown. And I'm like, who the heck is Cooter Brown? I don't even know who that is. What are you talking about? And I've been educated on the bless your heart, understand all the permutations of that. But some of the things that you used to say, it cracked us up. And, I think it really provided some needed levity to the meetings.
Well, there'd be some, when it was intense, folks would get laughing, and if they get to laughing, then you're going to say, okay, now let's see if we can get to some common ground here. So
I think Cynthia Wittenberg said she has a copy or something that she told me, I have all those Andy-isms. Oh, that Andy. So, I need to talk to her and see. She told me.
All of these off the wall things were like, where in the world did he get all of those?
Usually there was a point to it. I mean, it was like licking the calf over again was like you didn't want to have to do that job twice, kind of a thing. But
we all were trying to figure out why you would lick a calf to begin with. That sounds like, a CPSC warning, a Consumer Product Safety Commission warning, do not lick calves.
Oh my gosh.
Actually, I will tell you a humorous story. There was a CPSC warning that came out on motorcycles, and it actually said motorcycle manufacturers have to put in their warning labels that you cannot lick the motor. And we were all just like, yeah, why? Why would you need to tell someone that?
I was going to say, has Andy been involved in the CPSC or something?
Yeah, and when you said lick the calf, God. I would always just think of that, thinking he can never go to the CPSC because we would have some really wild warnings.
Okay, it's like, well, we've focused too much on me, I think. It's like we need to turn this around a little bit. So tell us, Cindy, you've been in the industry for a while. You've been with I know the Brokers Association. You're affiliated there. You were with brokers. You were with express carriers afterwards and whatnot. How in the world did you get into this industry, first off?
I actually answered an ad in the paper. I grew up in Indiana. I grew up in Indiana and had no idea, what this whole industry was. And I moved to Michigan and I needed to find a job. And I was like 21 and I'm just applying for all of these jobs in the paper. I want an office job. I don't want to work at, some drugstore or, fast food. And so I answered all the ads in the paper, and that was before, internet became such a big thing. And I answered this paper, and it was for a company called CJ Tower. And my friend, and you would know him from UPS, John Van Walligan, was actually at CJ Tower. And he was my first supervisor. So I always blame him. When people get upset with me, I'm like, go talk to John Van Walligan because he hired me into this industry. So we can always blame him. But I answered an ad in the paper and I had no idea what this was. And I was hired to key entries in. And at that point in time, they would send you to Buffalo because they just had 6 northern border offices. And they would send you to Buffalo to train you. And after that 2 weeks of training in Buffalo, I was hooked. Man, I was interested. I knew what a customs broker was. I knew about international transactions. It was fascinating to me. And so I started learning more and more and more. And I was at that company for 4.5 years. And I said, I want to learn something new. They were still a small broker. They had been bought by McGraw-Hill, but they were still CJ Tower. And so I went to a company that did air ocean. The company name was Japan Freight. I have no idea if they're still around, but I wanted to learn the air ocean part of that. And so I spent 4 years there understanding, more broadly international trade in the air and ocean side. And I also became very interested and became the automation person within the company. They had, 5 or 6 offices as well. And they needed someone to work with their automated broker interface, the transmission of the entry data to the customs system. They needed someone to understand that. So I started working more closely with our vendors and became interested in how the information got to CBP. And when I was at CJ Tower, that was actually the first system that transmitted information electronically to customs. So I was working on the very first system. So I did that for a while. I worked for a couple other small regional brokers. I got into more of the automation. I got into more of the compliance side of things. I was at a regional broker called Wilson International on the Canadian border. I ran their U.S. operations, and customs approached me and said, "Hey, Cindy, we need someone who understands these systems. Would you be interested in working for us?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." When I was at CJ Tower, the first time you had to classify a shipment more fully was when I was at CJ Tower, and it was manual. You had to classify the top 3. And customs approached me there and said, "Hey, we need people who can classify. Do you want to come work for us?" And I was like, "No, I think I'm going to stay in the private sector." So they approached me twice in my career. And once I, kind of had worked for a broker, I was approached by the NCBFA, the National Customs Brokers and Forwarders Association, and they said, "Hey, we'd like you to come run our education program." So I said, "Okay, that sounds like fun. Let's do that for a couple of years." So I did that. And in doing that, I really had a large profile. I had worked with customs, of course, on automation programs and gotten more involved over the course of time on a national level. But that really enabled me to have, kind of day-to-day contact with customs. And also a fabulous person that worked for NCBFA at the time, John Kent, was their lobbyist. And John would call me up and say, "Cindy, I need you to go here tomorrow and talk about this thing." And that was literally all he would say. Go here. It's a law firm. You're going to talk about the entry process at the border. Like, okay. So I would show up, and the first couple of times I did this, it was a little unnerving, but I got used to it. And one time he asked me to do that. He asked me to show up, and I showed up, and I was the only non-lawyer in the entire building. And there were like 20 people there. They were all lobbyists and all lawyers. And I sat across from John like, what is this? He didn't say anything. And it was when the Lacey Act was first enacted. And the Lacey Act is actually a bill that required importers to transmit the genus and species of any wood product. Only it didn't get passed in the normal trade channels in Congress. It got passed as the Farm Bill. So no one on the trade side in Congress knew about this until late. No one in the trade knew about it. The NGOs, the non-for-profit organizations, were pushing this. And it had gotten into the law, and customs and everyone else was like, how do we implement this? We have no way to implement this. So they brought me in and said, explain the process at the border. And I just remember it was the most fascinating meeting. I will never forget this. They sat me next to this gentleman, and he was talking very passionately about how this law was going to combat deforestation on a global basis. And I said, and how do you think that's going to work? And he said, we think when the shipments come in, the customs officer are going to stop them, and they're going to determine if it's endangered wood or not. And then we're going to deny entry to that and seize it. And I said, that's interesting, because I doubt the customs officers would even be able to tell you if it's real wood or not. And I remember he was just so surprised by that. And John looked at me and he said, that's why you're here. I'm like, okay. So it's to talk sense into people. But it was all of these lobbyists on the environmental side, and all of them on the trade side, and all of them from
They live in a bubble.
Yeah, who live in a bubble, and each their own individual bubble. So I was there to pop their bubbles and make them realize this is something that we need to do. And that's where the phased-in approach that we have today was born, was, hey, what are you really interested in? And it turned out to be pool cues, some high-level flooring, wood instruments, and some very decorative boxes. So I said, let's focus on that. So we got them to all agree. But I remember this gentleman next to me, we took a break. We all got some coffee. And I said, let me introduce myself. And I introduced myself, and he introduced himself. And he said, I am Alexander von Bismarck. You can call me Sasha. And I said, okay. And immediately, having lived in DC, I'm thinking, there's the von Bismarck rubies in the Smithsonian. There's the von Bismarck, emeralds in the Smithsonian. So he basically had built his life around philanthropy work, and deforestation was his thing. So it was my first introduction into a real tree hugger, and also that whole NGO type of point of view. But anyway, after I left there, customs came to call because ACE, the Automated Commercial System, $4 billion project. They'd spent about $3.2 billion and delivered 30% of the system. And customs is not allowed to actually recruit you. So that's against the law. So they highly encouraged me to apply. And they highly encouraged me to apply for 6 months before I would actually do it. And they finally wore me down, and I went to ACE and spent, 2.5 years there. My role was to turn around the system, with a lot of help from you and others in the trade to do that. And Brenda we were both executive directors, Brenda Smith, and she owned the policy side, and I owned the automation side. So from there, I went to DHL, had my own consulting firm, went to FedEx Trade Networks for 7.5 years, and have recently left, retired from there, and started my own consulting firm. So,
what's your name of your firm?
It is Trade Force Multiplier. And that was the name of the consulting firm I started 9 years ago now. And my friend Amy Magnus came up with the name. So shout out to Amy Magnus, because she would always say,
you know what? I love Amy Magnus. Amy, we were in and I don't know if you, let me just regress here a minute. I relayed this to Brenda, and you probably will remember. We were meeting as that workforce, we were talking about the entry simplification workforce, work group, whatever. We were in New York City, and we were meeting as a group, and we'd spent in the morning in discussions, and Amy and Mary Jo Muglio were the two brokers, and both ladies, let me tell you something. I have such respect for them. They're phenomenal. They are, listen, I mean, they're going to forget more than I'm going to learn. That's how smart they are. And with that, I will tell you that anytime I opened up my mouth to make comment on something, they jump on it like a duck on a June bug. I mean, they were just like all over it. And I'm going, dang gum, we're not getting anywhere. And it was just, contentious. And so we broke for lunch. We came back from lunch, and it was all of a sudden, there was a lot of harmony there. We were working, and we made significant progress that day at the end of it. And I think you and Brenda both came to me and said, what the heck did you do? And I said, well, at lunch, I made a point that we all went to a certain little place, and I got my lunch, and I sat down with both Mary Jo and Amy, and they were both going, oh man. And I just told them, I said, look, I know that we're on opposite ends, because most brokers at the time could not stand the express carriers and whatnot. And I said, look, there's a lot more that we have common ground on than we don't. And so we both all three of us committed to at least trying to find the common ground and seeing what we can do. And I attribute both of those ladies, Amy especially, to their leadership and willing to work. And we, we made some great strides in that. And there's no question, y'all have been, really good in so many aspects in what you've been able to do. But that all said, I will say that, Cindy, you were like, I can remember on some of the things we would look at in some of the meetings, not just the workforce, I'm just talking other meetings. And you were like, a tornado going through a trailer park. I mean, it was like unreal. You were just, tearing things up, upsetting the apple cart, but it was, there was getting something done, because ACE had been a project that had been, millions and millions of dollars had been spent. It was way over budget, under performed, and deadlines were being missed and whatnot. And I got to say something that I never had the opportunity, unfortunately, to get to meet Burson face to face, and I always regret that, because I always wanted to meet him. I thought he did some phenomenal work and busting through some things there in the getting, if you will, again, getting things done and whatnot. And y'all followed suit, and it worked out well. Y'all have, just some great folks within customs that came in line. But when you have that kind of support, I know it's like, as you're trying to go through and bust out some of the bureaucratic things, are there any things that you would do different than the way you went through some things?
I would actually do things quicker, believe it or not. I came in a very unique position. I came from the trade. It was one of the highest level non-political trade positions that had ever been appointed. So I had to have actually the DHS secretary's approval to be hired. Dan Baldwin was my boss, and he is the one who, tried to convince me to apply for the job, and eventually I did. He actually hired me. The week they announced my appointment, they held a COAC meeting in Detroit, where I lived at the time. And Burson met me for the first time there. And we just had a great rapport immediately. And he's like, what are you going to do? And I said, here's what I think needs to be done. And he's like, fantastic. And at that meeting, he told everyone from the trade and from customs, because all of the top brass from customs were at that meeting, and then all of the high level trade representatives. And he told everyone at that meeting that he went out and personally recruited me from the trade to take on this position, and that I had his full support. And that was day one. That doesn't happen. That absolutely doesn't happen. What I found, because I'm thinking, oh, okay, this is, it was my experience, so I didn't know. But I didn't realize that for a few years, that was really unique. And that set me up to be, okay, everyone in senior leadership at Customs knows I have his backing. And then everyone in the trade knows that he's going to back me. So I was able to move really quickly because no one put roadblocks in my way. And he told me about a year in, he said, Cindy, anyone puts a roadblock in there, you let me know and I'll clear it for you. You tell them that this is what I want. And I only had to do that a couple times, but he absolutely had my full, was in full support. He had my back. And that was the only reason I was able to make such great progress, but I would have done more, because I did allow myself to be kind of waylaid with the bureaucracy a little bit. And I wish I had kind of pushed that aside. And as Vinny Annunziata used to say, he would come in he worked for me, he was my director. They originally would come in with like a 40-page deck, just going through, and they would lose me after 10 pages. And so I'm like, you need to simplify this, put an executive summary, I need to bottom line this. So they got better and better and better. And in the end, they would come in with like a 3 to 5 page presentation. This is what the problem is. This is what we want to do. This is what we need from you. And I'd just say, go do it. Go do it. Just go do it. And eventually he joked that he was going to get the Nike swoosh on his hand right here, because every time he went to pick up the phone, he'd say, I'd see that. And I'd put it back down and say, just go do it. Because he knew what he needed to do. They needed somebody to clear the path to allow them to do that. I would have done a lot more looking back.
Well, I will say that, and I know Vinny very well too. Vinny Annunziata is, folks, he's just been a phenomenal guy. He's nearing retirement, so he'll be a big catch for somebody in the private sector. I can tell you that. But he and his other team members in there, the one thing again that I greatly appreciate, Burson created an opportunity there yourself. Even, on Brenda, on the policy side, I started seeing things moving quicker, which was good because, policy is usually several years behind, and not to criticize, it's just the fact of life of the way things are. Yeah. But, and so all said and done, I got to say that, what I saw in Vinny and his team, they were empowered and it made a difference. And I can remember, sitting in meetings at times where we were walking through, and to your credit, you literally got out to the trade. And so you would bring your entourage. And that was where I'd always tease and kid around like, yeah, I'll be the president of your fan club there and whatnot. It's always a joke with us. But it's like, I greatly appreciated what you guys had to go through. I understood the bureaucracy of the government is like, man, you guys are cutting through here like, an icebreaker here. He's like, dang, this is great.
I think a lot of that, honestly, was just my naivete. I didn't know how it was supposed to work. So I just made it up and worked the way that I wanted to. And it kind of fit what we needed to do.
Well, see, traditionally, though, when you start getting the government involved on a project and it gets to a certain point, and you're going to be making about as much progress as a turtle on a fence post. And it's just like, they're just going to sit there and, and going through the motions and whatnot. And it's like not getting anywhere. But, it's like getting that turtle off the fence post and down on, and it's like, let's progress on. It may be slow, but at least it's steady and eddy and off you go.
And Cindy, so you're talking about how you had a lot of support and all that, and when you were at Customs, how I don't know, because maybe you don't know because you've been away from it for a bit, but how does that differ from today? It almost seems like today
things are different. It's a different environment.
Yeah, like today, I feel like they may want to do something, but they kind of contradict themselves sometimes, and then like they're like counterproductive on some policies. And I don't know. I mean, like I guess I kind of want to understand it. It seemed like those were the glory days, like like things were actually getting done versus now. I don't know. Am I wrong or?
No, you are. And it's like, I look back on those days, like, everyone talks about their high school days. I was a football, leader. I was a cheerleader. That's my glory days is at CBP. I think a couple of things are pertinent here. One, I brought a perspective from the trade that they hadn't had. And they have, brought some people in from the trade, but they haven't been at a level where it really makes a difference. Because I think my number one job at CBP was as a translator, to translate what CBP wanted to the trade and to translate what the trade wanted to CBP and put it in terms that we could both understand. So I think a lot of it was that, because I think a lot of times customs and the trade talk across each other because they really don't understand the other's point of view that deeply. So I think there's a little bit of that. That's a challenge. We need somebody from the trade in there. But it's hard, to get folks to go to the government, to leave everything. Customs brokers aren't necessarily known for being risky in their behavior at all. So, not a lot of folks are open to going and doing that. I think the second thing is, especially right now, you have an acting commissioner. Anytime you don't have a political appointee, you have less say on what happens overall. You have less input because you're acting. Most people in an acting role are going to go in there and they're going to just keep things going. They aren't going to try to make waves. If they're forced to make decisions, it's because it's a big, impactful issue, like forced labor, big, impactful issue, going to have some downstream effects. Also, de minimis Section 321, and we can do a whole nother session on those two things. But really, it's because they try not to make waves because they don't have the political backing. A lot of the commissioners come in, like Burson, he had absolutely 100% backing from DHS secretary, from the White House. So he could make things happen. Acting secretaries don't have that necessarily political power to make things happen. They also don't have the power to, can they do this? Yes, but it's less effective when you're not a political appointee. You can't pick up the phone and call the commissioner of FDA and say, hey, we need to get this done. Because I saw Burson do that. I saw some other folks, McAleenan do that, to break through some of those barriers and having an acting secretary really inhibits that. And the third thing is there's a lot going on right now. It is a very erratic and chaotic geopolitical atmosphere. So you have a lot of things going on. One, we went from a very pro-trade, post, World War II, pro-trade environment, free trade environment. Everyone wants to trade. Let's make this easier. Let's facilitate this. It's better for the world. We can help developing countries. There was that attitude. In 2016, regardless of where your political, beliefs lie, in 2016, we moved into a very enforcement-oriented, more, hey, everything, everyone's our enemy, kind of in trade from that perspective. So it shifted very dynamically how trade was being viewed. And as a result of that, there was a heavy enforcement posture coming not just from China, not just from other areas, but all of these trade actions happened in rapid succession. So it was almost like whiplash. When the current administration came in, there was this thought that it was going to be softened somewhat. And we haven't seen that. And if you look at the political parties, typically the Republicans are more pro-trade and the Democrats are less pro-trade. I won't say that they're against trade, but they're less pro-trade. And we all thought that there would be a softening from that very hard Republican stance, and we haven't seen that. A lot of the trade actions that were taken are still in place. There has been maybe a more diplomatic approach and discussion on that, on trade overall, but those enforcement measures are still in place. So it makes it hard to navigate the politics as an agency, as a leader of an agency, in a manner that allows you to really move things forward. So that does filter down in the agency. There's a reluctance to make hard decisions. There's a reluctance to, send out things that might be considered controversial because they don't have a political leader who can go and say, we absolutely need to do this, because they don't have that power. Not that Troy Miller wouldn't do that, because I think he would if it's a big enough issue. And I've seen him do that. But it just, by the nature of him being a career person, he doesn't have that political pull. And that filters all the way down into the rest of the agency. When you take those factors, it's very hard for those middle level folks to come out and make significant changes. And then you have a lot of trade policy that's being made outside of DHS. You have the International Trade Commission making a lot of it, USTR making a lot of it, Department of Commerce making a lot of it. And CBP is left to just enforce it. So it becomes really challenging when you take all of that together and look at it as a full picture.
Well, and to that point, here's one of the things that is frustrating to me. And I will say that so many countries around the world all want full access to the U.S. market. However, U.S. goods are not treated fairly abroad. I've said that for a long time. And again, I will say that the scenario where there was a change, I get it that things were in 2016, as you're saying, there was a change in that, but it was trying to get more reciprocal. But what's happened now is, in the current scenario where I have some issues, there are no trade deals being worked on. Any trade discussions that are going on focus on renewable energy and like labor rates and labor environment. Okay. But there's not an actual trade deal being worked. As such, in the current modern day environment, the U.S. is no longer the largest exporter of grain. And, and so some of these farm deals and all that, well, guess what? Brazil has usurped us and is now the largest exporter of grains. And as they're working out trade deals with other countries, it's not a case where all of a sudden now the U.S. really wants to work out a trade deal. And these other countries are going to say, okay, let me go ahead and start working and doing business with the U.S. again. It's a scenario where you lose it. It takes so much to get a customer, as we know in business. And when you lose them, it is 10 times harder to get them back. Well, that's where we're at in some of this thing, some of these situations. So as we're looking at this, and then you look at the environment, like, for example, the BRICS situation, where there is a concerted effort that's being chaired by China and Russia in particular, but to circumvent the U.S. on so many fronts, to replace the U.S. dollar as for the basically the international currency of exchange, is to circumvent any Western banking sanctions, and to basically do business with other countries other than the U.S. Okay, you've got that effort going on. We have fallen behind regarding those kinds of scenarios, and it is negatively affecting it. So as you're saying, Congress in this scenario is not working well together. I mean, the House and the Senate, it's polarized. I mean, I got to say, we had the best economy in the history of this country, and now it keeps going down. And then as we're turning, well, the impact now, the ripple effect, is that the average citizen is paying higher prices, or they're frustrated because things aren't getting done. Well, they're not getting done because we can't seem to come together. Compromise is not a negative word. It is a good, you start from one position and another position, and you got to come to the middle. Well, the effects on this is where you and I trying to influence people, somebody make a decision, and that's probably tough.
I think, I think it was like whiplash, and now I see more and more we're coming to kind of a a middle ground because of the effects on the economy, because on the effects, in trade. We aren't going to see, a wholesale abandonment of a lot of the trade issues that have been, raised in the past, 6-8 years. But I think my hope is that cooler heads will prevail. There will be an understanding that, we are not an isolated economy. And when we try to be an isolated economy, it has a detrimental effect on our population. And I think I see, some recognition of that. But I also see, like you said, an unwillingness to really compromise on what's moving forward. And again, some of that also is who is actually doing the talking. There used to be a much more inclusive discussion. You'd have folks from USTR, you'd have folks from, Department of Commerce, but you'd have folks from CBP, you'd have folks from DHS, you'd have folks from, Census, and all of those people would come together with the trade as a key element and discuss those, negotiations. And we haven't seen that, at all. And I think that's where an opportunity lies, is to go in and really help the Hill, help the government really understand how important that is to us. But at the same time, you have a very, anti China stance. You have we have to protect our own supply chains, which is extremely important. Critical supply chain elements, we do have to have that in the United States. And I agree with that. But let's recognize again that we are a global player, and we need to lead the world in global trade, and not let others step in and do that.
Well, with that, let me, we're getting kind of long in the show here. Let's talk a little bit about what do you see as some of the top, maybe, regulatory affairs type issues or agenda items that people should be focused on. With your background, obviously you've seen it both from the private sector, the government sector, different, small companies, big companies. What do you see right now that seems to be something that people should be focused on?
Enforcement. CBP has enhanced their targeting system internally. They have enhanced their analysis ability to understand the data that's coming out of that targeting system. And they are getting much better at determining what are issues. And I think that's driven a lot of the enforcement actions that we've seen, not just forced labor, which, came from the Hill, but also de minimis enforcement, definitely, anti-dumping duty and other trade measure enforcement, anti-fentanyl. They are better able to see the problems in trade than they ever have been before. And because of that, international traders, importers, exporters, customs brokers, freight forwarders, carriers have to make sure that they have an approach that can identify the risks that they have effectively and then take actions against that instead of being reactive. We're at a point now where companies have to be much more proactive on their risks and mitigation strategies than they do, in the past, where they were much more reactive.
To your point, though, that's the one thing that, we've been talking through this is like, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is anti-slavery. That's a big issue that is permeating down. We just had a show that talked a little bit about it, that people are getting into a audit fatigue as they're trying to track down with and how they're, what's the word I'm looking for here? Maybe your tier one's your immediate supplier, your tier 2 and tier 3 down, digging into it and trying to find it. And people aren't responding. What do you do? That kind of stuff. I guess when you're vetting new suppliers, even vetting customers or vetting products from these suppliers, that's something that it seems like, and we keep pushing this, but would you agree from your perspective that you really need to go and do that on the front end before you start actually employing these things or whatever? And if so, what do you think may be the most effective way to try and vet this? Because it's a big task here.
I think automation is key here. You have to have automation because, like you said, there are suppliers who aren't going to respond. There are roadblocks you're going to meet when you're trying to go all the way back to the origin. And that's really what they want, the origin of everything on your bill of materials. Not just your top 3 suppliers or 3 tiers down. You need to go all the way back to the origin. And it's not just forced labor, Andy. It's the deforestation laws. It is the IPR violations. It is you need to know your supply chain from an AEO or CTPAT perspective. We are getting to the point where importers have to know everything all the way back. And the only way you can do that is through automation and AI, really, because you are going to be limited into the data that you have and the data that you have access to. And your supplier may go to their supplier, which may go to their supplier. But when you get to that tier 4 level, they're like, well, what do I have to do with you? And, I don't need to do this. So you need someone and a tool that can map that entire process. And that requires someone who has a larger data set than just one trader or one customs broker or one forwarder. You need to do that in a federated manner so you only see that, but it needs to rely on a larger database of information. So that's going to be key. You're going to have to invest in that if you're a trader now. It's like all the other tools that you've invested in. People don't want to do it, but we're getting to the point where you really have to do that all the way back to origin. The key here, I think, is what opportunities can that afford you? If you're going to make that investment and you're going to have that visibility because it's the right thing to do, and now it's the law, so you have to do that. How can I leverage that data? How can I file that data and give visibility to CBP? And this is really what I used to call a progressive entry filing. I've wanted to do this for 15 years. And now we are at a point where the technology has met with the opportunity to do that. So that's one of the things that I've been in discussions with CBP, with the Hill, to say, let's get this in the next iteration of customs law to say there has to be there is an iterative filing. And maybe that's the trusted trader, is I can give you customs visibility all the way back, and then you can just access that information. And then I don't have to provide that after the fact for so many things. There's huge opportunity there. And there are some companies that are working on that, like Altana, like Measure.io, like some of the other, Exeger. They have the ability, they have each individually, they have individual strengths and weaknesses and tools. But I see companies like Altana really building that full scale out because they want to have that opportunity. They don't want to be a broker. They don't want to be an ABI vendor, but they want to collect all of that, put it through tools, give importers some value on that data from an enforcement perspective and for CBP, but also, hey, here's an opportunity. How else can you use that data? And I think that's really an opportunity for traders that they haven't looked at. They see this as, I have to do this. I have to make this investment. Oh my gosh, it's costly. I'm not going to get anything out of it. Okay, turn the thinking and say, I'm going to invest in this. What else can I get out of it?
Well, and to streamline the process, I mean, that's the other thing that the earlier you can get the information to, customs, but the other, agencies that have jurisdiction over your commodity, the quicker you're going to know, is there going to be an issue here? And do I need to supply more information before it arrives? And go from there, or if there's going to be an inspection on that or whatever. Plus, you can also go through and establish the scenario. We've done our due diligence. We've seen this particular client versus, or this origin versus, somebody else. So, those kinds of things. So I will say that in looking at it, you were talking about the automation, but you also, I think, would be important is folks, if you've got scenarios with some of this, you know, and you're asking questions, what do I need to do? And you're getting tired of the same old, and you're only going through certain things. Maybe you need to call for an expert to come in and help walk through it. It doesn't have to you don't have to have somebody, you know, re-engineer everything, but you better have somebody come from start to finish and then come back and go, here are your weak links. Or here's where you could streamline some of that. And that's where, I mean, quite frankly, I mean, to a sense, you know, to help plug your company there, Cindy, that's one. But I mean, there's lots of consultants out there, but it's okay to have an expert that knows what they're doing, or a team of experts to come alongside with yourself and maybe other people within your company to go as a team and say, let's walk through this and see what do we see, and having somebody guide you through that. And all that. So we're going to put your contact information in our show notes, Cindy, and whatnot. So
my website up there. Love to, you know, talk to any of your viewers about what we can offer. And
hopefully maybe there will be a project you and I can tag team on. We always have a lot of fun together. We always get a lot of, we accomplish a lot, but it's, you know, it's one of those where we want anything that we've done, and I've said this, and you know, you want your team to cross the finish line together. You don't want somebody way out in front and then everybody else straggling behind you. You want your whole team to cross together. So that's we've enjoyed that. So anyway, Cindy, we appreciate you being on. You know, I got to tell you, I love you to death. You're a great one, and I, you know. You're very sure. You're one of the sharp tools in the shed, as I would say. So you're a good one. So,
well, I have heard that saying before, so I can't consider that an Andyism.
No, I on my end, I'm like the not the sharpest tool in the shed. So I have to, you know, make my notes and go on that. So who knows?
It's a force instrument.
Yeah, there you go. Blunt force. There we go. Cindy, I appreciate you. You're so much. It's like I learned something. It was a revelation. I didn't know you guys were keeping track of Andyism. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. I wish I could find those books. I'll have to dig them out.
Oh my goodness gracious. Well, Lalo, my friend, it's like, I'm going to turn this back over to you. It's any closing comments for us or about Cindy and what we got here?
No, this was a really fun conversation, and I'm thinking to myself, we definitely need to have her back. Cindy, you need to come back and we'll talk about other stuff. But I'm also thinking because, this is awesome because I know when this show is going to air, either right at the end of the year or right at the beginning of the year. So it's a perfect primer too, to just start thinking of and looking at yet another aspect of trade that you need to be looking out for. Because I know we'll have other shows that are talking about other things, but this one was a really good one because I don't think we've heard that before. So, and I'm really glad that you brought that up.
I know one thing is we definitely need to have you back because I want to get into a really good discussion on de minimis and whatnot. So, and maybe we come out on together on the scenario, but I need to hear some other perspectives of some of the things I'm hearing. Cause I think in the end, the end consumer is the one that's going to be on the short end of the stick. So we need to talk through that.
Yeah. And love to come on and talk about, you know, what you need to know for the new year, what you need to prepare for, what's going to happen in 2024 from a trade perspective. Yeah. So
that would be awesome. Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, thank you, Cindy.
All right, folks, y'all have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com or you can DM us on Twitter @simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.